now. So welcome everybody to session 4 of Classic Metal class. It's me and Scott. Scott is is it a cafe or a studio up
It's a
in
cafe.
Massachusetts?
Yeah, but behind this door is a theater. So it's like major acts like Pat Metheny and Blue Oyster Cult and stuff play at this place. But this is their front room cafe.
Ah, there we go. So today we're going to talk about a philosophical topic and connect it to heavy metal. And both the topic itself and the subtopic are things that Scott and I have been talking and thinking about for a long time. So we've both been really looking forward to this show. The topic is mimesis or imitation and how it connects with art. And we're thinking specifically about something that we've got mixed feelings about all over the map, and we've hashed this out in a number of different ways. And I think there's some things we agree about and some things we disagree about, and that's tribute bands. Something that's really an important part of the landscape, not just for metal, but for music in general. But we're going to focus on metal bands in particular. So this notion of mimesis or imitation and how it connects with music goes all the way back to Plato and Aristotle. They both looked at different kinds of musical modes as being imitations of different passions or emotions. So you play the right kind of music and you get people jazzed up. You play another kind of music, in Plato's case, he thought it was the wrong kind of music, and people get kind of languid and sleepy and pleasure seeking. You play other kinds of music and they're ready to go out and fight. And, I don't think there's quite such a one-to-one correspondence between music and the soul as that. But it's clear that music is imitative in some degree. And if we think about classic heavy metal, there's imitation going on in a number of different ways. Every time that a band plays that song, they come out on stage and they say, "Hello, Milwaukee, how are you?" They're saying something that they've done before, and then they're going to launch into their first song, which is an imitation of the thing that they played on their record. And when they recorded it, it was probably the thousandth time they'd played that song together, or in some cases maybe the second or third time, but in most cases they've rehearsed it. So music by its very nature, and then expanding it to include the spectacle and all the other things, is imitative. Scott can talk about this. When you're learning songs, so something that we've talked about quite a bit is you get an artist who wants you to play with them, and they're like, "Here's the song list." Right? You're not making this stuff up. And if you're going to be doing a good job as the performer, as a gigging or studio musician, they don't want you to be too original, right?
For the most part, that's a good point. I just did a show with a synth pop artist named Casey Desmond, and it's very specific. There's parts that were extremely specific. So there was no room for me to go, I'm going to be creative here or hit this note here. And that has to do with the sound too, to get the right sound.
Yeah.
Or sometimes you'll have an experimental artist say, "We're hiring you for your sound. What do you add to this?" But they still refine it to a degree, right? They have to. And
that's what makes it that song, right? If you think about guitar solos, where a guitar solo is a component of a song. So let's say just crazy idea, right? Iron Maiden is playing in Boston, and Adrian Smith gets sick and Yannick Ayers gets sick, and they're like, "Who do we have that can jump in right now? We need to play the Trooper." And they're like, "Well, Scott Tarulli's in town. We know that he really likes it." And you get in there. When it comes to Adrian Smith's parts, we'll leave Yannick Ayers out of the picture because I know you're not a big fan of him. And he's really not doing anything.
He's a great guy. It's not
as a third guitarist. But so when you go to play, Adrian Smith's parts, if you just start, like, as you call it, noodling and doing some jazz solo, is it still, you can still hear the rest of the band doing the song, but you're not properly engaging in mimesis, right? And people are like, "What the hell is this? What's this guy doing?" Right? It would throw everything out of whack.
That's a great point. The guitarist that plays with Roger Waters, they did the Wall tour.
Okay.
And, he said he does the Comfortably Numb solo on the top of the wall in front of 20,000 people. And he said that's the most stressful thing because people paid money for that ticket to hear that solo and experience it the way it was on the album, note for note.
Oh.
And so, you know, there's some, like you said, there's some solos that are absolutely part of the song. People want to play air guitar to it. They don't want to hear, albeit a good guitar player, noodle. They want to hear the Comfortably Numb solo or the Trooper. You have to play that solo the way it is. It's part of the song. I mean, if I went there, I would play Adrian's stuff note for note because it's part of it's. People expect to hear that.
Would you only do it because people expect to hear that? And this is a little before we jump into our main topic, but I'm really curious about this. Or would it also be because you're like, well, it's Adrian Smith, and I've been listening to him since I was a kid and I really admire him, so I'm not going to mess around with his stuff. It would be kind of presumptuous of me to, like, you know, change it up. Is that part of the equation?
That's a big part of the equation. So let's just say Bruce Dickinson said, Scott, I want you to do your thing tonight. I would probably
it wouldn't be Bruce Dickinson, it'd be Steve Harris, right? Because if Bruce Dickinson said it and then Steve Harris didn't nod,
you're right.
You'd be screwed.
So, but that's a really good point. I would say it would be out of complete respect for Adrian Smith or anybody. It would be, for me, and not all people look at it that way. This is not the time for my ego. This is not the time for me to go to the world what I can do. This is the time to pay respect, have the opportunity to pay respect. And not all, I mean, you could get different musicians that will say stuff, but you hit a good point. I would absolutely be paying tribute and respect to one of my influences.
So this is a good kind of segue and warm up for our main topic of tribute bands, right? Because what makes a tribute band a tribute band? They're engaging in mimesis, they're engaging in imitation, and they're doing it in a very, very specific way. They're not just saying, well, we're influenced by Iron Maiden, we're influenced by Motorhead, or the singer is influenced by Dio. They're actually trying to be, in some respect, a facsimile or I don't want to say a knockoff. I mean, I think in some cases they probably are, in bad cases. But they're trying to do something that captures the spirit, and not just the on a general level, but down to the specifics. Being able to play the same notes and take like the same stances on stage. If you're a Judas Priest tribute band, the bassist should in some respect resemble Ian Hill, I think, and we could I gotta let somebody in. We can think about all sorts of other topics. One of the things I wanted to start off at the beginning was thinking about what's the difference between tribute bands and other kinds of bands that do involve imitation, like parody bands, or just plain old cover bands. So let's talk about. I mean, you've talked about this quite a bit. What's the difference between a tribute band and a cover band?
Well, a cover band is you go to, say, a club, and you play recognizable songs to people, not even in a specific genre. So let's say you're doing. Some clubs, they're like, can you keep it down the first set? Well, you play your mellow stuff. You might play some jazz standards. You might play some soft rock. But then, they're like, can you get the people up dancing? Well, you might be playing Earth, Wind, and Fire, Michael Jackson. You might be playing Def Leppard. So it's stuff that people recognize, but it's not really tribute to a specific band or specific thing. It's just that you're not playing your own material. You're playing stuff to entertain and sell drinks. Yeah. And, to a degree, quality doesn't matter that much at this point. I've seen some really bad bands play out of tune and out of time, but as long as some of the drunk people recognize the songs, it's the best band they've ever heard playing on stage.
I think that recognizability factor is really the key thing. They're looking for and that maybe certain songs lend themselves to that well if they've got really emblematic kind of
Right.
thing. Like, you know, like with the Trooper, right? When you hear the intro, you know it's the Trooper. Or when you hear, you know, da 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 da, you know it's Ace of Spades, right? You
Right.
know,
Yeah.
we could actually do a name that tune for some metal stuff, and there'd be other things that you're like, I don't know what the hell that song is. I don't know what that person is playing. You know. Um,
Yeah. Right. You know, it's funny just to cut in. A lot of original artists used to have this terrible plan that they would say, we'll play a bunch of covers, but we'll sneak some originals in. And then they thought that they would gain a following.
and that doesn't
Because,
work.
oh God, no, because your demographic is people that want to drink to songs they hear on the radio. So
Interesting.
if you're up there and you play Taking Care of Business,
Yeah.
you know, if you play Sweet Home Alabama, if you play Guns N' Roses, but then you put in this unrecognizable song that you've written, you lose your audience
You know,
because
it's interesting because the early, like proto and then really early metal albums, you think about Black Sabbath, you think about UFO's first two albums, Deep Purple's early albums, they all included covers. And it was kind of like expected that you'd have one or two as part of what you did. And then as you know, you became a bigger band, you didn't have to do covers anymore, you know?
although the covers you have to realize that not in every case, but in a lot of cases that could be the equivalent of writing a bad song for filler. Or we've got 4 killer tunes,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
let's just, you know, I mean, like a lot of the songs.
So they're not paying tribute to the great artist by doing that. I mean, there are some cover songs that
Maybe.
have really transformed it. You think about Judas Priest's "Better by You, Better Than Me" and compare it to the Spooky Tooth, or Green Manalishi with the Two-Pronged Crown. The Fleetwood Mac
Right.
thing isn't even remotely close to that. Or of course, Diamonds and Rust, right? Um,
Sure.
or if you think about jumping forward, Wasp's cover songs, which I actually liked in some cases better than the original. Like I like the Real Me that Wasp does a bit better than the original. And I think in those cases they are paying tribute to the artists who influenced them, right?
That's, you know, that's definitely possible. Although, you know, it's kind of like you know, Van Halen started out as a cover band. If you look at the videos in 1975, it was all like, and that became pretty much Van Halen too, right?
Okay.
But you know, like, but it was, you know, Pretty Woman, the same tune, except
Yeah, yeah.
David Lee Roth hamming it up and Eddie with his sound. You know, it could have been just like, we need 3 or 4 more tunes, and these are songs we played back in the day in the clubs. You know, it's hard to know. It's hard to know. Sometimes people do tribute albums to a specific artist.
Yeah, I was thinking about incorporating some discussion of that into this. And I was thinking, well, that's kind of a different thing from an actual tribute band.
It is.
It's sort of like a set of covers done by those bands in their style of a artist who they really respect, you know. So when you listen to Motorhead doing a Dio song, it's Motorhead, you know.
Right. Yeah, I mean, if I were to do a sit down and pay money and get studio time and do arrangements of a song, let's say a Dio, like a tribute to Dio, that's actually different than a bunch of us getting together going, you know, who should we mimic in this scene that would make a lot of money? Well,
Okay.
we like Dio. So,
Yeah.
and so we get together, and we know it. We get it together because, well, it's we're going to earn money doing it, and the places will be packed. And a lot of these people were in cover bands before, but cover bands aren't even doing as well as the tribute bands.
Yeah, so let me actually, we'll take some of the questions that are here on the site, but I want to read you something from Milwaukee Magazine. Kevin Kosterman wrote this interesting article called "A Tribute to Tribute Bands." And he said, like its unholy brethren, the tribute band makes its money playing another band's music, but instead chooses to focus on just one act. To varying degrees, the band does its best to emulate the dress, stage presence, instrument tone, and attitude of some of the greatest bands in music history. I think that's a really succinct way to define what a tribute band is. And before we jump into those questions, let me reread emulate the dress, stage presence, instrument tone, and attitude, and of course the music of the bands. Is he leaving any key element out, you think, or does that pretty much cover the gamut? Dress, stage presence, instrument tone, attitude, music.
Well, you know, a lot of the tribute bands now don't have any of that. They just play the songs. So down the road here, there was a Tom Petty tribute band. It was basically a collection of weekend warriors that wore khakis, and you know, they were just, so they showed up and nobody looked like the act. They didn't have the same instruments.
Oh,
but you know,
they
they
playing
like
Tom Petty music.
they're Tom Petty music, but like, you know, where it's clearly a Telecaster through a Vox.
Yeah,
They're just whatever they had in their basement. And so the big part of this that I kind of has talked to you prior to this is, you know, how much is this of the musicians getting together and playing, and how much of this is is society or people paying for it, and what did they expect? So there's a band called Physical Graffiti on the East Coast. It was one of the few ones. There was The Machine, that was Pink Floyd, and they were spot on. They sounded exactly like it. They had the exact clothes made from Song Remains the Same. Okay. They had the exact Marshalls. They had John Bonham's see-through set from Song Remains the Same, and it was surreal because you'd go to it when I was in college, and people actually thought they were watching Led Zeppelin because they had the moves down, they had the exact instruments, and it really sounded like Song Remains the Same cranked. I mean, they were, you know, that to me, that was a long time ago, but that to me was like, okay, that's somewhat of a fun experience, although it's not Led Zeppelin, but we can't go back to 1973, Madison Square Garden.
That was something I wanted to talk about a little bit later on. So let's take some of these questions. So Mark Smith says, this makes me think of an interview I watched of Tony Iommi. He says he gets confused when people ask him to teach them Black Sabbath solos because he never plays the same solo twice. He never commits it to memory. He goes on the feel. Don't know if it's just a fan of teaching, but what would you consider that as being? Is that mimesis? And I would say it is. It's a certain kind of like staying within a kind of groove. So when he plays, you know, the solo for Paranoid, it may vary from place to place, but it's not going to be something totally out of the blue, right? And so it's within a certain kind of groove. What would you say, Scott?
Yeah, I mean, there's some artists like, well, let's take David Gilmour from Pink Floyd or Joe Satriani, kind of, and they will stick to the solo. But then you take, well, you know, if I were to, anytime you watch any guitarist for Dio, for example, the last line solo is always the same. And
I wonder if you can't say that here we're looking at a key distinction between an actual solo and a set of licks that are put together in a certain way, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, you can't solo on the Trooper in a way that doesn't fit in with the Trooper, and with Dio, a lot of songs are that way too. If you're,
I think it makes such strong statements. So like, for example, in my life, anytime I've joined a band to play and they say, we're doing Crazy Train, if you don't play that Randy Rhoads solo, you didn't play Crazy Train. Even if you play that intro riff, if you don't play the solo, it's not right. So it was such a statement. I don't know. I mean, I guess if the guitarist plays this, if we're talking about guitar solos, the solos every night the same way, that's one thing. But like, how much of a statement did the solo make? So all the Vivian Campbell solos I thought were perfection, note for note. Every note belongs there, and no matter who followed in his tracks after that played guitar for Dio, played those solos note for note. Of course, if they were on the new album, they could play their own solos that they came up with. But Last Line, I consider that solo part of the song. Absolutely. That's just my opinion. I don't know if anybody would say, yeah, just noodle away. And I think what you're saying, you know, if I understand you correctly, a collection of licks together is kind of like.
No, I was thinking it'd be something a bit more rigid because the licks, you play the same lick, you've got a lick down, right? So think of a whole sequence of them as being, I guess we should, instead of calling it that, let's just call it a melody, which is what it is, as opposed to a guitar solo where you're kind of, I don't know, perhaps showing off more virtuosity and
right.
spontaneity to it, you know? With some guitar solos, they are essentially the melody at that point in the song.
Well, you don't take like NIB. Bo, bo, da, 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 da,
Yeah.
I mean, that's a guitar interlude break, but you have to play that.
Yeah.
Or the end part of War Pig. I mean, not War Pigs. The end part of Paranoid.
Yeah.
Bo, 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 bo. If you don't play that, that dreary guitar part, it's not. That's part of the song, I guess, right?
Yeah, and you can say it's an integral part. It's not something optional, you could say.
I would agree with that. I mean, personally, I agree with that. There's some parts that absolutely make the song the way it is.
So this brings up a really interesting point. Let's say we're talking about a Black Sabbath tribute band, and if it's really the case that Tony Iommi improvises a good bit in his solos, that means that in certain respects, whoever's playing Tony Iommi in that Black Sabbath tribute band is sticking closer to the recorded, catalog solos than Tony Iommi himself is. And we don't want to say, well, Tony Iommi is somehow, less in touch with Black Sabbath. He's the originator of the stuff, right? So there's kind of a weird paradoxicality to that, right? Imitating too closely could actually be less of an imitation or reproduction.
Well, this is a great point. Think about it. So you're Tony Iommi, and you sound like Tony Iommi.
Hopefully,
right?
If you don't, there's a problem.
So if he improvises every night, the audience still gets, or Richie Blackmore.
Yeah.
If he decides, but let's say I joined a tribute band, and I followed this subject to be like, all right, well, Tony Iommi said he improvises, so I'm just going to improvise. The problem is I'm not Tony Iommi, and I will sound like me. So I think it makes more sense what you say to stay to the or one of the live versions, or even if you took like from Live Evil or any of those, and you played licks from that. To be a tribute band, the audience needs to. I mean, you don't want to take these and do like, jazz versions of it or change the meter of it, because that's not really, that's not serving, but
and we got Helmet for that.
But you bring up a great point, as long as you take it from even, now I'm seeing people that do cover songs, the vocal part, like I saw some woman do Reason to Live by Kiss.
Okay.
And she does these things that aren't from the record, but are from these live videos from '88. Like, every Kiss show is documented. Oh. And I could hear her singing what Paul Stanley sang in Budapest, 1988, or Philadelphia. And it's kind of a wink to this fan to go, we all know that version, but it's still a Paul Stanley lick. Right?
Yeah. I guess you could say that there's the catalog in the sense of what's recorded on records, on masters somewhere, hopefully still existing. And then there's a broader catalog of the bootlegs and videos and all those sorts of things, a wider universe of catalog. Let's take a couple other questions that are here. So Alfonso says, maybe the cover band, because of environmental expectation, are not held to a higher standard. A song with recognizable riffs might up the status of a cover band. So I think that's what you were saying. They're just not. You don't expect what out of a cover band what you do out of a tribute band, right?
Right. Well, I always use this term sensitive layman, right? So you don't have to be a musician, but a sensitive layman is somebody that may not be a musician, but really is keyed into the art. In other words, I'm not a painter.
That's a good distinction, yeah.
Yeah, so
it's not just an amateur, right? In the classic sense.
So I did my time in the bars, and it was just the drunk girls coming up, staggering, going, "Can you play Blister in the Sun? Can you play Melt with You? Can you?" And I've seen bands play very poorly, and I don't mean that as a judgment. I just mean like they haven't tuned up and they're not together and they're going to wrong sections. But people are going crazy, and people go, "This is the best band ever." Well, what they're responding to is they know the song, and they're excited about the song. But there is a distinction between listeners. So, like, I've played like this room, and there's a lot of musicians that, well, not this room, but the actual theater, and for other artists, and they're non-musicians, but there's something that moves them, even if they can't express it.
There's an interesting distinction that this guy Paul Ricoeur makes, and I forget exactly what book he does. And he's talking about the difference between subjectivity and objectivity, and how people are like, subjectivity is bad, objectivity is good. And, when you're thinking about like the drunks in the going up to the band and being like, "Hey man, can you play this?" And then if you do a few lines from it, they're like, "Yeah, that's recognizable as that, right? That rocks, right?" So that's subjectivity, right? It's purely on the side of the subject. And whether or not it's objectively good, totally up for grabs, right? They don't know. But Ricoeur says we place too much stress on this distinction. What we really ought to be talking about is the difference between bad subjectivity and good subjectivity. And I think good subjectivity captures what you're talking about as the person who is a kind of qualified listener. They've put in the time. They're not necessarily, I mean, they might be a musician, but they're not like a professional musician themselves, but they can listen to it and be like, okay, that's off. You're not, you're doing Bark at the Moon and you missed these things that are in it. And I can't play it myself, but I know that Jakey Lee doesn't play it like that. So right. I think that can be a useful way of thinking about it. It's not yet objectivity, because you can't write it all down, with perfect criteria with a checklist. But there is something there.
Well, there's also that whole, I talk to people. It's like, well, you grew up with rock, and they might not be able to say, well, this band swings, this jazz group swings, but. And I go, how do you know if a band's rocking? Well, they don't know. You just know it if you hear it. I've said that before. So if you go in, it might be the bass hitting you here. It might be the tempo. It might be, but those are people that are making the distinction. They might not be musicians, but you can move them, even if they can't put it into words. Like, it's because the bass was placed here and the kick drum was here. No, it's just general good experience.
That's an interesting thing to say, because I remember going to shows where I would be listening to it and the guitars would sound great and the singer was the sounding good, and the drums were usually too loud, but that's the way to do it. And the bass, the way they'd mixed it, it was just like thumping, and you couldn't tell what was actually going on. And you actually knew it was supposed to be there. Like, I remember going to an Accept show down in New York City where they played with Raven. And
Udo?
No, it was Baltes on bass and Wolf Hoffman on guitar. That was the one actually shortly before Herman Frank got fired, and then the drummer quit too.
Okay.
And like, total side note, but Hoffman was treating Frank like crap on stage. You could tell that there was a lot of tension going on between them, and Baltes actually looked embarrassed at certain points. But I knew what Peter Baltes was playing, because I knew I'd been listening. I've been listening to Accept since I was like, I don't know, like 14 or so. So I know with each of these canonical songs what I'm supposed to be hearing, and I wasn't hearing it. And it was because it was mixed badly. And, it didn't make it into a bad performance, but I was like, I wish they could have done a better job. I don't know who was running the boards at that time. But if I was somebody coming into it, there were a few young kids in the crowd who, maybe don't have that kind of memory built up in their head already. And I don't think they would have heard a good performance in terms of the bass, whereas the guitars were fine,
Oh, and I found that at a lot of shows, the bass is just more of a percussive hit.
Yeah.
And there's a note distinction. That drives me crazy. It's disappointing because you don't want to discredit.
It goes to show you just how contingent the performance is, right? Because you can be playing great, and if the mixer isn't doing his or her job well, then what are you going to do, you know?
Exactly. If you don't mind, I want to jump to Kay has a cool question here.
Yeah.
Sorry if this goes a bit off metal end of things, but I've often thought about this with regards to Rush and Alex Lifeson solos. I like this question so far. I understand that the solos he did were rather etched in stone. He always played them note for note live. There's always been a part of me that thought, wouldn't people be interested in hearing Lifeson could do if he goes off script? Well, let's take Limelight. Actually, I heard that yesterday. That solo is note perfect. And honestly, if I paid my ticket, and I've seen Rush many times, if Alex didn't play that solo, it'd be disappointing. Now, Alex is admittedly
what if you played another solo that was just as good, though?
Well, see, that's what I'm getting at. He's admittedly not a good improviser. So if I said, Alex, put your note on anything, like, you know, I'm a huge Alex Lifeson fan, especially the stuff he started with the 80s with the comping he did. He's a brilliant, he's in my top 10. But if I said, Alex, put your finger on this string, play Happy Birthday from there, he probably couldn't do it first try. I don't think his musicianship is geared towards that type of thing. He didn't focus in on that. He focused in on a unit coming up with these perfect parts to make a 3-piece band sound like an orchestra. Huh. And he did that like amazingly. Now, it's interesting with the Alex Lifeson thing because they've always asked, like, do you guys even jam and sound check? And he says, not really. He goes, that's not what I'm not really about that. So the Limelight solo, he might have sang, but very few of us could improvise something that good. I mean, that is the sound, the dynamics, the effects of a note fading off and another one coming in.
Yeah.
But you know, in all of them, it's kind of like very haunting. It's very post Andy Summers to me, or very post The Edge. So it's like after those guys came Alex Lifeson's contribution to this big worldly sound, the Big Money solo. But if you listen to it, the whole band is playing the solo. Like the Big Money solo, if you hear listen, the bass goes with it, the drums, and everything builds together. If he were to improvise, he better be able to roll with all that stuff. And I think what he said many times is, that's just not in my wheelhouse. That's not what I've worked for. And but I guess early on he did, like with Working Man, he just went for it. The early Rush stuff, and it was very unfocused, but it was raw and it was great for what it was. But you could tell his crafted solos are much better than him just noodling the licks, although he did have a great attitude and energy when he played. But I like the Alex Lifeson thing. And do we consider them any degree of metal? I mean, maybe
Rush, early Rush is, yeah.
Yeah, early Rush, yeah.
You know? I mean, they're sort of metal adjacent, let's say, you know? Yeah. It's sort of veering in and veering out depending on what they're playing, you know? So
yeah, the early stuff was definitely post Zeppelin.
Yeah.
And you know, once with the Canadian singers like Triumph singing the Stratospheres.
Yeah. I was just thinking about Triumph actually. Well, let's jump into some of the other things that we had lined up. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is when we talk about a tribute band being good, what actually makes them good? You know, you talked about tribute bands where it's basically just people getting together and saying, let's play some Tom Petty stuff. That's not a good tribute band yet. You've got to have some of that imitation of some of the elements. I mean, you don't necessarily, it'd be hard to find perfect physical copies of the people that you're doing. That's why Kiss tribute bands are a little bit easier to pull off. You just put everybody in makeup, right? Gore would be even easier because you can do all the prosthetics and stuff. But so, you know, you want some similarities, and you do need to have not just musical talent, but I think some showmanship, because metal bands are, they're doing performances. They don't, I mean, we joked, me and Scott, quite a bit about Richie Blackmore, not being somebody super engaged with the audience. He's not out there like, on his knees, he's not going to like put the guitar behind his neck or do any fancy tricks like that. And he scowls at people, but there is a Richie Blackmore kind of presence. And if you were a Deep Purple band and the guy who's playing guitar is like, grinning all the time, maybe that's not as good of a performance, right? I suppose if you were like a Queensryche tribute band and your singer isn't kind of, let's say full of himself, maybe it's not the full Queensryche experience too, And I think some musicians would be a lot harder to pull off. I mean, think about trying to be Blackie Lawless in a Wasp tribute band. You got to play bass, you got to sing, you've got to be out there in front of everybody, that would
with
be
that look. With that presence.
Yeah, exactly. So there's all of that showmanship, the spectacle part, and then there's a similarity in sound. Presumably, you got to like the people that you're playing, or else you're not going to be. It's going to be a tough gig to do that night after night after night. And then there's a kind of, when I was thinking about this, I thought, and I don't know how to explain this that well. Maybe you can help with this, Scott, but you want to have the experience. You want to feel, at least to some degree, like you're not necessarily seeing Kiss on stage or Led Zeppelin or Iron Maiden, but you're seeing something that is connected to them. So there's some sort of essence that you're engaging with, rather than just a bunch of people who got thrown together to make some bucks.
Now, this is hard for me because as a fan and as a listener, I have no interest in tribute bands, really.
Okay.
Now, I do want to make a distinction before we continue on. There's different levels. I have a friend named Emily that was in Brit Floyd, if you know what that is. That was the official Pink Floyd band from, I think, Australia.
Okay.
Believe it or not, Brit Floyd. And they would sell out 20,000 seat arenas. They were playing around the world, and she's also in Rumors, the Fleetwood Mac tribute band, which is actually endorsed by Mick Fleetwood himself. Oh. So when she was in town, I went, and Mick Fleetwood gets up and says, these are my friends. He names them, and this is great. Now, they were actually shared like the stems of some of the records, like Tango in the Night and stuff. And she said, our job is to do it no different than the record. It's supposed to sound exactly like the record, not like their live.
That's kind of weird, isn't it? Because people go to live performances of the band itself because they don't want to hear just the record. If you go and a band was just playing everything exactly like the record, you'd feel kind of like, well, why did I come here?
Well, but the problem is the demographic that pays for the ticket doesn't want that. They want exactly what the record sounds like, which I know I don't agree with it either. That's why I make the distinction.
This is some wild speculation.
Okay.
But do you think that the fact that we have music in like digital form, super easy to listen to, you don't have, all you got to do is like click a button to hear the song again, rather than actually having to go over and like pick the needle up and put it back in the thing or rewind the tape. Do you think that, I don't want to say produce that change, but do you think that has some sort of factor in wanting that? I want this reproduced exactly so. I mean, it's different kinds of mimesis in a way, right?
Although there's a variable you're missing, and that is if on my laptop I click, I'm hearing a fraction of the frequencies I should be hearing. Mm-hmm. So if I play it on my laptop, for example, or even in headphones, the MP3s are lacking a lot of the frequencies. So if you go see it live, you're hearing all the frequencies. Now, you and I, most of us, I think, grew up with vinyl and cassettes. And even if we had a cheap Sears system, we heard the bass, we heard everything. Yeah, and as you turn the vinyl up, it got fatter, right? Yeah. You turn an MP3 up, it'll damage your ears. So I don't know, because I guess we should ask somebody that was born in the year 2000 or 2010 that if they hear it live, that might be the first time they're feeling the bass here. They're hearing the full spectrum of what they should be hearing. What we grew up on, which was the industry standard, was your parents had a receiver, a turntable, nice speakers.
Yeah. And if you were really, really lucky, or your parents were rich, they might have a dual tape deck.
The dual tape deck when your friends came over, right? Can I have that song?
That was so that we could, and we should do that. We should actually do a whole thing on this about the transmission of tapes. That was essential for copying music. You know, somebody would have a tape, and you know, bands that couldn't afford to put something on vinyl, it'd be a demo tape that they'd do, and then you dub it and then distribute it. And I got to hear so many bands precisely because of that. You know,
it was a great way to reproduce your own music.
True.
So if you had like a 4-track recorder, if anybody, you know, it's like in the 80s, it was a recording studio that had a cassette, and you could record up to 4 tracks. So a guitar, you put drums down, bass, guitar, and vocals. That was your 4 tracks, and you would mix it.
Yeah.
But back to your question, as far as like, you know, should it be produced sound like the album? Well, I would say the danger you run if the band wants to take leeway with, let's say it's an Iron Maiden tribute band, and they want to veer away from it. Well, now you're injecting something that's not Steve Harris. That's not, because you can't be Steve Harris. I can't be Adrian Smith. So if I have my own ideas, that might be something Adrian Smith would never consider or play.
Yeah.
So I think if you're going to do a tribute band, it's not time to, if you want to be creative, there's other ways to do it. If you want to do a tribute band, well, you know, diehard fans know every note and every, you know, click of this note. Oh, you know, like this, where, you know, his voice cracked on this one live album. Like they know every detail. And I'm not as I said, I'm not somebody that would pay to go see a tribute band.
So let's talk about some of the aesthetic and ethical issues that are connected with this, where I know that we don't see things entirely the same way, but there's some overlap. So one of the things that I know you wanted to talk about, and I'm going to frame it in a very provocative way, to what degree are tribute bands basically just riding the coattails of the bands that they're imitating? You know, they're benefiting from the fact that Dio, who's not even on the scene anymore, did all this stuff, and now they get to do it. They're not like making their own music; they're making somebody else's music, and they're often. You brought up examples where a band may actually have trouble getting gigs, in part because they're older, they need more stuff. But a tribute band is cheaper, and they'll like get, you know, consistent business doing their shows. So I know you had some things you wanted to say about this. I'm going to let you have the stage for that.
I think what you're getting at is what a lot of us don't think about. So when I hit the realization that I was playing side musician to a lot of original artists, and then I have my own original projects. So if I go out, well, you know, seeing 20 people come through the door is disappointing. Although 20 years ago, people would line up down the road and for these things. But here's the thing: at first, you know, I would play this theater, and it's like, well, we sold 60 tickets out of 2,000. That's embarrassing.
Yeah.
You know. So, anyways, at first it's like, you know, well, this is terrible. Like, you know, I used to sell out places like this. But then they're like, well, sorry to say, but, you know, the next time we book you is here because we have 8 different tribute bands in rotation. So my first instinct was to be angry at these tribute bands, which is silly because a lot of them are my friends. But if you really think about it, it's more of a reflection on society and what they want. So we can go on forever about that. So why people in our demographic are they going to put down the money, you know, to see Dirty Deeds, AC/DC, and they'll sell it 4 nights straight. So you're thinking 8,000 tickets for a band to cover what's already been done. So it's not a reflection so much on the musicians will do what they need to do to survive.
Yeah.
Right. If they can. Go ahead.
So
Yeah.
I was gonna make a distinction here, and I think um, it might help with that. There's bands where they're still out there doing work, touring, and all that, and they're still like in good shape to do it, right? With
Oh, I see.
AC/DC, right? You know, Brian Johnson can't really sing anymore; it's too dangerous for him. He might be able to come back, but it's not going to be for long. Malcolm Young is gone. Angus is still playing, but it's not really the same thing. Kiss is kind of in a similar thing, and I want to talk about them in a bit because they're in a weird situation with their franchising thing. And obviously, you can't put Led Zeppelin back together again. So I think in cases where the tribute band is allowing an experience that otherwise couldn't be had either because of space or time. And I'll talk about why space matters in just a minute. I think maybe there's much more legitimacy to that, to offering that to the audience. There's a positive good being offered. Now, if it's a Queensryche band, or let's say it's we'll use Queensryche, right? Let's say they all get back together. Right now, I think there's still 2 different Queensryches out there, unless I'm mistaken. But if you have a Queensryche cover band, we'll call it, Rage for Mind Crime, right? Just make some stuff up. They're, they're really doing what you're talking about. They're filling seats and filling their pockets, kind of at the expense of the actual band, right? Which isn't getting booked quite as much. I think these are 2 different kinds of situations. And with the time and space thing, so Australia has a long history, going decades back, of having lots and lots and lots of tribute bands. And the reason is because it was so hard to get bands to actually come to Australia because of fuel costs. And, it's tough to bring a whole set, right? And so, it makes sense for there to be a Rainbow tribute band if Rainbow's not going to hit Australia. Although Rainbow actually did hit Australia. Now that I remember, Ronnie James Dio was in an interview talking about how people knew him before he actually got there because of that kids show that he was in, that rock opera.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think these are different. I think that, like, so let's take Kiss for example, right? Gene Simmons, Paul Stanley, I think they're in their 70s. Even if they manage another decade, it's not going to go on forever. So if the tribute band becomes the way in which you actually get to see something like what you otherwise can't see, or Motorhead, right? Lemmy's gone. And the band members, rightfully so, said, we're never going to put together another Motorhead because it wouldn't make any sense. Lemmy's gone. A Motorhead tribute band, I think, is a different animal than an Accept tribute band or a Loudness tribute band,
Yeah, I mean, this is where I'm kind of like a sourpuss about the whole thing.
You're like, no tribute bands.
Well, I mean, that's not fair to say, but I guess that's as Miles Davis said, that's what records are for. So Miles Davis, to use, he did his era in the '50s with Kinda Blue, and then he did My Funny Valentine. Yeah. At the time, jazz musicians played songs on the radio because they could improvise over it. So, everybody would recognize the songs they were playing. Then he got into more experimental things, and people would come up to him and go, "Why aren't you playing My Funny Valentine? Why aren't you?" And he goes, "That's what records are for. Isn't that what records are for? Buy the record." So, this whole notion of, I'm going to do a Queensryche tribute band. It's not any disrespect to the band. It's shocking to know that people will be just as satisfied paying for the tribute band that they would. When Jeff Tate is quoted joking, saying, "If I really wanted to make money, I'd join a Queensryche tribute band."
Well, there's funny cases of people from main bands going to audition for tribute bands and being turned down, being told they're not enough like XYZ.
That's like the Seinfeld where Kramer auditions for his own part.
Oh, right. Yeah. I think, there's a lot of issues to unpack here. I think we might have to do another thing about this down the line. We should probably take some of the questions and comments. Let me scroll up a little bit. Okay, so this is from Mark. I guess there's also the issue of whether a band can provide their own spin to the material, or whether it needs to be completely faithful to the original. Some people want to hear covers with some interpretation. Um, I think that's probably uh, the case, although in the bar crowd, maybe not so much, right?
It comes back to sensitive layman versus drunk. I want to hear rock and roll all night, party every day.
Yeah.
As long as you play, we're waiting for that one. We don't want to hear the deep cuts of Kiss. We want the tribute band to play Kiss Alive too. In that order.
That's kind of a problem that even bands that aren't tribute bands run into, right? One of the things. So this is a good segue into something that we were going to talk about.
Yeah.
Bands that effectively become tribute bands of themselves. So I wanted to talk about Kiss, and I know that you have some ideas about Night Ranger and Def Leppard. So I'm going to let you go first with those two observations on your part.
Well, yeah. So, as far as Def Leppard, I'm a High and Dry and Pyromania fan. High and Dry is probably one of my favorite records. And I remember when Hysteria came out, it took a while for me to appreciate it, but then they toured it in 1988, I think, right? Am I right? Mm-hmm. And they did In the Round. So I didn't see that tour, but I saw them in 2001, 2006. I've seen them about 6 times, and it's the Hysteria set. They play the whole album, and then they play Foolin' and the hits. And I'm thinking, well, every summer for the last 30 years, they put out new albums. They never play anything from the new album, and they won't touch anything from High and Dry. Yeah. And my big problem Night Ranger, who has a great catalog of music, has a Night Ranger set that they call it, which is the same set from '85, the Seven Wishes tour. So Mike, and they put out records, but if you go to it as a fan and you pay the money, you're going to hear the bar crowd set, that I call it. Yeah, but as a fan of Def Leppard, where's 5 songs off the new album? Whereas the big band, or back in the day, if a band toured, the kick drum had a picture of the album on it. Yep. And they opened, the first 2 songs were from the new album, and you'd hear at least 5 or 6. And then that happened with Night Ranger, and they had an album out at the time, and I'm friends with a couple of the guys in the band, and I was backstage, and I brought the CD, and I said, will you guys sign it? And I said, you gonna be playing this tonight? No. Why'd you put it out? That's good. And I'm not naming names, but they said, well, it's a Night Ranger set. But that brings the question, well, you're just pretty much a tribute band to the 30-year-old self you. What about Night Ranger, or what about Def Leppard today? What about me hearing what music you've made the last 6-7 years exclusively, and then maybe you do a 3 or 4 song encore set with the hits? Of course, I'm in the minority on that thought. But here's my solution. So Def Leppard and bands like that will play 10,000, 15,000 seat places with other bands. If they were to do a House of Blues, which I think the House of Blues is about 5,000 seats, they could do artistically what they want, and then 5,000 diehard fans would buy the tickets. And if you didn't like that they were playing the deep cuts in the new album, well, stay home.
And you see bands doing that go to so I mentioned seeing Accept and Raven at the Gramercy. That seats I think about 300 or so in New York City. And when they're there, those bands are playing the old standards, and they're playing stuff off their new albums, You could say the same thing about the Chance in Poughkeepsie, a place that I know I've been to before and seen some good shows, including Udo there. Same thing, played some Accept standards and some older Udo stuff, and then played stuff off the new album. So I think you're right. Maybe venue could play a role in it. When they know that they're with a more serious metal crowd.
They're actual real. You're connecting with your actual fans, not the ones that heard "Pour Some Sugar on Me" on the radio and then are there to get drunk and be nostalgic about it.
Yeah. It's fun. I got something really funny to tell you. So, I'm turning 50, and I put together like an Amazon wish list, and it includes like concert T-shirts and like books, basically. Now, I saw something on there, and I told Andy about this, but I don't think I told you or anybody else about this. There's actually, it wasn't labeled as starter pack, but it was something like that, and it was labeled as something like, you know, rock guy shirts, and there was a Def Leppard shirt, there was an AC/DC shirt, and I forget who else it was. And it was like, it was for people who don't know anything about basically not even metal, but even rock. And these would be like the shirts that you could wear where people would be like, oh yeah, I think I've heard those bands before. And it was labeled as if it was just for like some dude who doesn't really listen to anything other than pop.
They call the poser. Yeah. Oh, and not to get off, before we get off the subject,
yeah.
Do you remember the Sam and Dave tour where Sammy Hagar and David Lee Roth went on tour together?
No, I don't.
Oh, so what they did is they alternated sets. So the night I saw, Sammy Hagar went on first. And Sammy Hagar did some Montrose stuff. He did some Van Halen stuff. He did stuff off his new album. So Sammy Hagar, and he killed it. The crowd was going bananas. Yeah. Then David Lee Roth comes out and says, you didn't want to hear that last set. I know what you guys all want. And he played pretty much the first few Van Halen records only. He played all the biggest hits. And that was an interesting thing to me. It was like, okay, we had one act come out and say, let's go back to the 70s.
Yeah.
And then we had one say, okay, we'll do a little of the Montrose. We'll do a little, some of the Van Halen. We'll do my solo stuff. And we'll do 4 songs for my new album. Yeah. And I love them both, but I actually enjoyed the Sammy Hagar set because I'm open to hear the new stuff. And actually, most of the time, if anybody's with me, if anybody can comment on this, if you've been to a concert and you didn't have the new record, but the band played 6 songs from it and they were great songs, the next day you're not buying the record.
You know, it's interesting. I know we've gotten in the habit of like getting the new record before we go to it, so we know what's going on. But we've seen Judas Priest recently, on the Firepower tour. Saxon. I forget exactly what their new one that came out was, but they played like 5 songs off of that one when they.
That's amazing. I love that. It's 2020. Well, not with COVID, but I want to see what's going on today. I want to hear. Your creativity did not stop 40 years ago. So I like hearing these.
So this is a good segue into Carl's question. I'm thinking about legacy type bands that have revolving door memberships and continue even after the original members are all out of it. The Temptations, Herman's Hermits, Plastic People of the Universe, out of Prague. I wonder where the line is between legacy and tribute. So that is a great question. I got to wondering if there could be a legacy band that isn't the original band but has the imprimatur of the original members and a business arrangement where the original band gets a massive cut of the band's profit for going out there and extending the brand. So that is what KISS is talking about doing. And when I say KISS, I only mean Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley. Not Eric Carr and Tommy Thayer, who are not, they're not getting a lot of the money. They've essentially been stand-ins for Peter Criss and Ace Frehley for now in Tommy Thayer's case, I think 20 years. And Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley are talking about licensing KISS, getting some other people to fill in for them, and like continuing in perpetuity.
Well, they're not the first ones to think of that, because I told you my friend, she played in Brit Floyd and she plays in Rumors, but they're sponsored by the actual band.
That's right.
But I played for the Temptations for a tour, and that's a good observation because there's one original member, but he's not really original. He joined during the Cloud 9 era, Glenn Leonard. The rest of them have passed. So it was 3 guys that actually were like basketball coaches. They're really good. And Glenn, who joined in like the mid 70s. Yeah. It was an honor for me to play this music. But you're right. Like we talk about you talked about this last one. When does the band cease being the band? So in other words, Foreigner, one original member, the guitarist.
Yeah. Another good example like this is Thin Lizzy.
It's Thin Lizzy.
I don't see them. So for a while they were touring as Thin Lizzy, as And Scott Gorham said, we are essentially doing a tribute to Phil Lynott by doing this. We're not going to make any new original music. We'll do that as Black Star Riders. And I haven't seen them tour as Thin Lizzy for a number of years now. When we saw them with Judas Priest and with Saxon, it was as Black Star Riders. And they played some Thin Lizzy songs, but now they're doing their own thing. And I think Thin Lizzy is effectively retired, you know.
Well, I like that idea of we're doing a tribute to, because I mean, really without Phil,
you really can't. Yeah, I don't think you can have Thin Lizzy without.
Can't have Iron Maiden if Steve Harris hangs it up.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's true. The fact that Bruce Dickinson left and came back, and Adrian Smith did, showed that they're not completely indispensable.
No, that's a very good point, because
there's a question though. What if Steve Harris was replaced by his kid?
No, well, we're talking about Wolfgang replacing what's his name in Van Halen? Eddie Van Halen's son,
replacing Michael Anthony.
Yeah, that's not the same. As Michael Anthony has his own voice and his own bass style. Yeah. And I suspect that all that was pumped in. I can't confirm that. I don't want to start rumors.
What do you mean by pumped in?
That means that Wolfgang was playing to tracks.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if that's true, but sometimes with the harmonies, sometimes it sounded a little too much like Michael Anthony's vocals, which is very signature to the band.
Oh, yeah,
The bass parts I'm not totally sure about, and I don't want to start rumors, but I've seen some of the stuff going, okay, you put your son, that's great. You keep it in the family. It's really Van Halen now because you got 3 Van Halens. But I think Michael Anthony was such a huge part of that band. It's hard for me to, as long as there's Eddie. But yeah, anyway, yeah.
No, I'm actually with you on that. I think that you take Michael Anthony out of the picture, and now it's sort of like a side project.
But even with Sammy Hagar was still Van Halen, because it was a different band.
More or less, yeah. I mean, I think we used to call it Van Hagar, and I think that was kind of right.
But at least he came in with a whole new sound and his own new voice, and it would have been horrible if he tried to do the David Lee Roth thing.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of like when we've been discussing Rat, right? So Rat is still out there touring, and they still have the 2 vocalists, and they have Juan Crocier on bass, and he's a very important presence, but it's not enough without Warren DeMartini,
I agree. Yeah, Warren DeMartini is such a huge part of the sound.
Yeah. You can't replace him with some young guys. Let's take some of these other.
Yeah.
So Andy says, think about the shared experience of something like War Pigs, or even the vocalization on that All Right Now is a major part of the collective fan experience. Every time, and actually, it's not just a Priest show; it's like become a standard. Although Priest certainly does it, we see it every time a Priest show is about to start, since it's the last song before they take the stage. And if we left that little bit off, it would feel unfinished, incomplete, missing. Even though it's sort of like a throwaway, it's essentially like a vocal lick, right? All right now, who knows what was going through Ozzy's head when he said that. But it is indeed, a central part of that song.
I see that. So as long as before they say stage left. You're talking about Andy's that you just read. We see it every time that a pre-show is about to start. Since the last time before they take the stage. Oh yeah,
that's become part of the performance too. Is playing. You see this in between sets, right? There's like a DJ and they're playing certain songs, and the whole crowd kind of sings along to them. Crazy Train is a favorite. What's that?
We call it PA music, right?
Okay.
Like a PA music meaning, like AC/DC was always in the rotation. Always.
Right. Yeah.
The songs to get the crowd psyched up, and wait for the lights to go down, right?
Yeah.
So it's part of the experience anyway.
It's become part of it. It wasn't originally part of it, but and the way it became part of it is probably kind of accidental or contingent, things just caught on, and people were like, well, let's do that next time.
My guess is like they start low, and you notice like as the songs go on, they get a little louder every tune. So it's almost like they're warming up the crowd's ears,
Oh,
You know,
yeah, yeah.
but it's become for me, it was the big thing. You go in there and they'd be cranking, like artists, right?
Yeah.
So if you're going to see, uh,
You're not going to hear Hall & Oates.
you're not going to, although Steve Harris did say they played Journey a lot because he's a
Really?
big Journey fan.
Okay.
And he said the crowd would boo it.
Really?
And he said, I don't care. I love Journey. They're an amazing band. We play them before we go on stage, like a bunch of their tunes. And he goes, the crowd will boo them. But I guess that's an exception because I think the point is to get the crowd. Every time the song ends, the crowd goes bananas. Are the lights going off?
Yeah,
the show
yeah. Yeah, and everyone's walking back with their beers and whatever.
They're $15 beers.
Yeah. All right. Alfonso says maybe for metal it's a bit difficult because many metal songs are through composed to a large degree. Parts of the song may have been improvised in the writing stage, but it's repeated from performance to performance. But it sounds like much depends on the song's actual content and arrangement. And maybe you could say there's a bit more malleability early on. Once you've been playing it for 20 years, it's kind of established, right? Kiss is always going to play Deuce the same way nowadays, right? Because song's like almost 40 years old, maybe more, right? 20,
yeah,
30?
actually,
Yeah, it's more. It's like 45 years old. Yeah. So, Alfonso says this might offer an interesting contrast to jazz, which is highly improvisatory, and pop, which can be in between depending on the artist. So you work in all these genres, Scott. You're a good person to comment on that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, jazz, I'm going to get philosophical here. This is the place. Jazz to me has become a process rather than a style. So the jazz process is making 1 minute's music in 1 minute's time. Whereas serious classical composition and say a pop production, you can make a minute music and take 3 months to make it. So, but the distinction here is making music of the moment with intention. In other words, if you know a bunch of licks and you just throw them together, that's not really intention, and that's not really music of the moment. It's kind of like if I know a bunch of words in Italian and I just start saying them, I'm not really holding a meaningful conversation or saying anything meaningful.
Yeah.
So, he's not metal, but I don't know why Eric Johnson comes to mind, but he'll play the song as it is, but then there'll be a section at the end where the band will go off together, right? And he might be playing some improvisation. So that to me, he's not playing the style of jazz, but he's in the jazz process where he has intention. He knows before every note and every phrase, he knows what it's going to sound like.
Yeah.
So pop, but if you go to pop, it is highly like the thing that I just did, which I really enjoyed, was note perfect, note specific, and pedal specific. Like I need this sound here and this sound there. But you have to I wear the different hats and I enjoy all of them. I don't think one's better than the other. As far as if you're playing for an artist, that's different from tribute band. Cause I don't know if I'd ever join a tribute band. I'd have to, dedicate myself to imitating someone else.
I was actually thinking about, no, it wouldn't be a tribute band. What if because I know that you're friends, what if Buck Dharma called up and he's like, listen, man, my arthritis is really killing me today. Need you to step in, and I know you've been, listening to the songs for years and years. And I don't want you to play it just like me though. I want you to have fun with it. Cause that would probably be the way he'd talk about it. Right. He wouldn't be like,
one to improvise.
Yeah. He wouldn't be like, I need you to do exactly what I do.
I couldn't do. No, that's an interesting point. I would respect his wishes. But that's his nature is music of the moment. He doesn't play, Burning for You, he'll play the same way all the time.
Yeah.
But, he'll go into he's all about that moment. And sometimes he says, I fall on my face. And sometimes it comes out okay. I can't sound like Buck. I mean, he's just got his own sound, but that's what I'm getting at. If I dedicated my life to sounding like him, I probably could, but I'd be a cheap imitation of him. And it's already been done. And he's not me. And he was born in a different era at a different time, went through he has a different past than me, grew up in a different part of, he grew up in New York. And, That's, that's one of the hard things. It's hard to pull off with tribute bands. is that you talk about time and space.
Yeah. So, one of the topics that I had wanted to bring up was you look at tribute bands as sort of like talent feeders. When, so Tommy Thayer, we talked about just a minute ago, when Kiss needed a new guitarist, they plucked him out of this band called Cold Gin, which is a Kiss tribute band. And it provided a kind of apprenticeship for him. Or, Tim Ripper Owens, he was, and there's, I forget what movie it was that had Marky Mark in it.
Rockstar.
That's right. Yeah. And that's sort of loosely based on the Judas Priest thing. So Tim Owens was in a band called British Steel, and they, these bands, when they were needing new component parts, let's say, they knew what places to go to find these people. Maybe that's not the case anymore today, where these are examples that are kind of old, but it seems like tribute bands, in a way, they're kind of like feeder leagues for the major leagues, aren't they?
Well, it's proven that, yeah. I mean, really, in Kiss's case, Ace Frehley was too drunk, and he would show up late.
Well, they went through a couple guitarists before Tommy Thayer, though,
But if you think about it, if I have a band like Kiss or Night Ranger, and you play the same set all the time, you can find a solid tribute band, and you bet they know all the parts already because they play them for a living.
Yeah.
So what better way to say, well, we have a ticket for you to come out? Well, Marshall set up, bring your gear, and here's the set. We'll run it once at sound check, and then you're on tour. It can be a breeding ground, absolutely. Because, they're ready to come in. They don't have to learn the 35 songs they have in rotation or their 15 songs they have in rotation for the tour.
Yeah.
I guess, those are two good examples of, somebody in the tribute band that just found themselves on tour.
It's interesting when you think about that. So I was just thinking about, I was kind of joking around. I'm not saying that I'm as good as Cliff Williams, but AC/DC's, nobody listens to that for the bass lines. Although they're decent. And he even talks in interviews about the fact that he doesn't try to do anything flashy, doesn't do any fills. He's got a role to play, and that's it, right? And you think, well, okay, so really anybody with sufficient preparation could come in and play the root notes, and the few places where the on the riffs where the bass is imitating the guitar. Now compare that to Steve Harris, right?
Sure.
If you can be Steve Harris in a tribute band, what can't you do?
Well, sound is a big thing of it. Don't forget.
Yeah.
Having the right sound as a bass player. That was those classic sounds, the Fender, where you hit it and it sits in the mix just the right way, is probably greater than the notes themselves for those bands. And a lot of them miss it. Like I always say, AC/DC, people do skip, scooped mids, right? They get rid of all the mids and too much gain. But if you listen to AC/DC records, there's hardly any gain on those. It's the bass with the guitar with a little bit of overdrive that makes it so heavy.
Yeah.
So it's, perceiving it the right way to imitate it.
That would be an interesting thing for us to do as another topic sometimes, almost sort of like the equivalent of optical illusions, but with sound, right? So when you're listening to AC/DC, you think, oh, I want to get that sound, I better do some distortion. Nope, it's exactly the opposite, right? It's a clean sound with the right kind of bass, as you pointed out. And I remember when you explained that to me for the first time, I was like, and then I went back and listened. I was like, oh yeah, exactly. That's what's going on. And I think there's a lot of cases where there are sort of, let's call them sound things that people are classically getting wrong. And they do this with particular riffs,
Well, Smoke on the Water, everybody plays that wrong.
Yeah. All right, we got to take some more of these questions before we finish up. I know I want to be respectful of your time. So Mark Smith says bands hardly ever come to South Africa. That being said, I remember there being a phase when CCR tribute bands were quite popular in the pub circuit. Killed the band for me. I suppose hearing it too much could do that, right?
Well, if it's not done right too, will see CCR. If you don't have the correct tunings that John Fogerty had, the guitar's not going to resonate the same way. So people might say it's a C chord and a D chord and this, but it's not real. They're not really presenting it sonically correctly the way John Fogerty would. Not to say everybody does it wrong, but there's probably enough of people that don't know the difference that are performing it.
Yeah. Oh, here's a good one from Carl. Where does the actual band end? Should I mention yes and cause trouble? Will that take up the rest of this session?
That's a great one. Right. And for a while, Trevor Rabin was singing lead when John wasn't in the band. And how can you take that voice out of the band and it still be yes? So Trevor Rabin, who is, he joined in the 80s, was singing lead and playing lead guitar. Yeah, where does it? We've talked about that. When is it not the band anymore?
Or when is it split into like sort of like bacteria? Which cell is actually the original cell? At a certain point, it isn't. Neither of them. If you have split offs and things like that, different people doing their own projects, and in a way, so this actually it's kind of an interesting topic. Let's say you have a band, right, and it's got 3 main people in it, and then the rest of them are kind of, they're not really the writers or anything like that. And those 3 main people go their separate ways, and they bring they're the nucleus for a new cell, and you got 3 different things out there, and each of them is playing the same original material, right? They're doing, to come back to our original topic of mimesis, they're doing mimesis, but they're each putting their own spin on it. So you wouldn't expect, let's say that Iron Maiden broke up, right? And Steve Harris forms a new band, and Adrian Smith forms a new band, and Steve Harris forms a new band, right? And they're all doing "Hallowed Be Thy Name" in their set list, and they've got different players. It's still going to sound very much like Iron Maiden, right? Because they're gonna gravitate most likely to people who sound kind of similar. We've got almost like a cacophony of different versions out there being played.
Yeah, but those are to me side projects, playing stuff from projects previous, like Sammy Hagar playing Montrose stuff with his current band, right?
Well, Montrose doesn't exist anymore, right? So if it's going to be played, and Ronnie Montrose is dead, even when he was
right.
I guess when Gamma Ray was out there and Sammy Hagar were both playing, you could have 2 different groups that were playing, Bad Motor Scooter or something, right?
Yeah, and I think that's different than being a cover or a tribute. That's kind of like, hey, it's like when Night Ranger plays Damn Yankee songs. Okay. Because Jack Blades was in Damn Yankees, so play a couple of the Damn Yankees hits, which makes sense, but I wish he wouldn't, because they have a huge catalog and 4 albums they put out that they haven't played a thing from. That's really interesting. Is what's the distinction between a band that is just turned into their own tribute band? But it all comes down to the audience and what they want to hear. Sometimes they don't even realize that the band's not the same. They're hearing the hits from you'd have to really, siphon out who's the sensitive layman and who's the diehard fan and who is there to hear the 2 radio hits that they grew up with and want to, get drunk and yell to it. There's nothing wrong with any of it. But, you're going to make distinctions. That's probably something you want to consider if you're an artist looking for an audience. Which is it?
Okay. So here's a question from Carl. The classic music analogy is an interesting one, but what has to be remembered is that it all starts with the score. Even if there's a recording that's considered definitive, there's an expectation a conductor and orchestra will have its own somewhat elastic interpretation of a piece. This gets interesting with players like Nadja Salerno-Sonnenberg, who established a reputation as a soloist, who, while adhering to the score, she might push the limits of the tempo given in the score, not taking liberties, but just giving herself a bit more room for interpretation. it's a bit of a different world. Conversely, as Alfonso's pointed out, recorded music creates a weird dynamic when you're talking about music that's heavy on improvisation. You might have a Sun Ra record that's way out there, or a record of an AMM performance, and if you listen to it 1,000 times, you're getting to know a moment in time that probably couldn't ever be reproduced live, but wasn't the point of the recording in the first place. Or, I mean, in metal terms, Sweet Leaf, right? Tony Iommi coughing after smoking a joint, and then it getting encore. I mean, it's not like it gets up on stage each time and, you know, takes a puff and then coughs into the microphone before they start playing.
Well, this is, you know, as far as the classical pieces, any classical performer will make a judgment on whether they're playing Bach, the tempo, the phrasing. So the Bach violin sonatas and partitas, you can listen to 10 different performances and they all sound different, although the notes are the same. The tempos might be pushed or dragged back intentionally. You know, Gaiden Kremer, who's most famous for the Bach violin sonatas, plays everything really slow. And his phrasing is different. Well, you know, we don't have permanized recordings from the 1700s of Bach. We only have the written piece, and the people that argue over the interpretation of it. But, you know, as far as,
you know, it's interesting. There's a whole bunch of things that are similar to that. You know, in culinary terms, we have these recipes, and they're not done in the same sort of manner as we do recipes today, that people have to play around with. Or, you know, like in swordsmanship, there's manuals of you know, the drills and stuff that you would go through, and you have to kind of imagine, well, what the hell were they actually trying to do with these diagrams and stuff. So yeah,
that's a good point. Yeah, you know, there was no permanizing devices. The only catching machine, so Bach improvised. Bach was a huge improviser. The only way to permanize the music was somebody to write it down. So instead of having a tape recorder, the piano, the inventions were improvised, but the only permanizing device was somebody transcribing it or him writing down what he just played because he had a photographic memory. But another point here I really like is catching a snapshot, and that's what recording anything is great, because chances are it can't happen that way again.
Yeah.
Right. So this is an important thing as far as any kind of performance is.
So let's do one last question from Beatrice. Do you think there's a right time to stop or split or whatever to prevent a band becoming their own tribute band? Or is it sort of a natural order to fall into that path and repeat themselves? This is a really interesting question. It's about like the band process. Now, assuming a band doesn't like screw it up because they all get strung out on drugs or they can't get along and they beat each other up on the tour bus or stuff like that. A functioning band over the decades, are they inevitably going to turn into a parody of themselves, essentially a tribute to their 20, 30-year-old selves? Or is there a path that keeps you from doing that? I mean, we've seen successful bands not doing that. Judas Priest is a great example. You know, they put on great shows. There's always some new stuff off the new album, and then the old standards, some of which are being done in sort of a lockstep way, some of which are being done in interesting ways. Saxon, another great example. Uriah Heep. They do stuff off their new album. They continue, you know, and they go way back to like 1970. What do you think? Is there just two tracks? You either like manage to become the band that stays fresh in some way, or you inevitably become a tribute band of yourself? What do you think, Scott?
You know, and I wish we could have like Jack Blades on this so he could explain his side, you know, from Night Ranger. You know, to me now, like Jeff Watson's gone, Fitz is gone. But you still have Brad Gillis, and you still have what's the drummer's name? Why am I blanking? Such a sweet guy. But you know, here's the thing. He might argue, well, who's some of them that say, like one of them called the alimony tour, right? So they've got to pay alimony, so they're going to go out and play hits.
Yeah. And, or now it would be, well, I didn't have a retirement account tour.
Well, yeah, right. You know, did you blow all your money? So that's an ethical thing. And I guess I can only speak as a fan, not as of course, all musicians don't think alike.
Yeah.
But yeah, in my opinion, stop while you're ahead. It's kind of like the last Van Halen thing was pretty upsetting to see. Or, I loved what Robert Plant did. I saw his tour a couple years ago with his new record, and he played the whole new record.
Yeah.
And like used up on three things, and I thought it was fantastic. He is not the horny 25-year-old he was in the late 60s.
Yeah.
That was
Andy and her brothers saw him a couple of years back and had a very similar experience. They thought it was really quite wonderful, and they said that when he played the old Led Zeppelin things, his whole affect changed.
But they say, why don't you write stuff like that anymore? Because I'm not 20, right? I'm not 20 anymore. That's what records are for. Back to the Miles Davis thing. If you expect an artist to not progress, well, that could be depressing for the artist. But that's why I don't understand. I mean, I understand the people wanting to fill big venues and make the money by playing the set they did 30 years ago. I get that. But I'm kind of surprised. Some of these bands say, the thing about like Night Ranger, they would play Dirty D's Done Dirt Cheap. They would play 2 AC/DC tunes, or Heart. When I saw them, they played 5 cover songs, including a 15-minute version of Comfortably Numb. Their catalog is amazing.
Yeah.
But why are they playing for 15,000 people? Why are they playing Paul Simon tunes? And if you enjoy that, you could play that on your own time. Tickets are expensive now. If people paid $150 to hear Heart, and they're hearing bad covers of stuff that a bar band could do, like Rock and Roll by Led Zeppelin.
Yeah.
But admittedly, the place emptied out. I mean, Nadia and I left after 5 songs.
Wow.
We heard one Heart song in 30, 45.
We did that, my daughter and I, at Summerfest with Foghat. And actually we ended up going to see Slaughter, who were playing at the same time. We were real excited about hearing Foghat because I'd introduced, she knew a few of the songs, and I was like, oh, this is going to be really cool. And we got there and we were like, what the hell is this stuff, And then we were like, I could tell she was kind of like getting disappointed. And I was like, well, let's go hear Slaughter. And I didn't have high expectations at all. And then we crossed Summerfest, for those who don't know, is this grounds that we have here for the world's largest music festival in Milwaukee, and you can go from stage to stage to stage. And it sounds like it wouldn't work, but it actually does. All these bands playing at the same time, because the music's going off in different directions. And so we went and heard Slaughter, and it was actually quite good, So,
they're great.
Yeah.
I really quick before we go, on the other hand, the Rolling Stones, is that Carl? Is K Carl?
Yeah.
Okay, but here's the thing about the Rolling Stones. Now, I'm going way back to 1989 when Steel Wheels came out. They were already, past their prime of putting out big albums. But when they did the Steel Wheels tour, they played 5 or 6 songs from that album. Yeah. Voodoo Lounge was 90s, early 2000s. They played, and then when I saw them probably 15 years ago, they did play 4 songs from the new album. But they're willing to play 2.5 hours. So you'll get 2 hours of hits, but then a half hour of the new stuff.
That's a lot for guys that old, And
it was fantastic. Yeah. It was, I saw, there might come a time where it's not fantastic. And that goes back to the original question, should you stop them?
Yeah.
You want to remember somebody how they were, not, at the top of the game.
Yeah. Well, this is a good place to end it. Once again, thanks, Scott, for coming on as a special guest, co-host. Thanks for everybody for your questions. As usual, I don't know that we got to every single philosophical topic that we wanted to get into, but this has been a lot of fun. So we'll pick up next month. We haven't already decided a topic yet. I've got a couple kicking around in my head, and we might have to revisit some of these as well. So
this is a big topic. Yeah, it'd be great.
Yeah. All right, everybody, have a great day.